Okay, so this is video 2 talking about Bishop's poem, In the Waiting Room, Elizabeth Bishop's In the Waiting Room. So we left off looking at the images she encounters in the magazine. And so one thing I would say is, remember, this is a 6-year-old looking at this magazine. And so I think it's important to not always jump immediately to certain interpretations that might be the way we might see things now. I think it's important to keep her age in mind, also the time she was living in. So we get those images I just saw, and then it's talking about these black naked women with necks wound and wound with wire, like the necks of light bulbs, and then it says their breasts were horrifying. And I guess what I mean about jumping to immediate interpretations there is that, one potential interpretation that comes up is, oh, this is racism because Elizabeth Bishop is white, the women being described are black. She says the breasts are horrifying, must be racism. I'm not trying to rule out that as potentially something to be talked about if you really find that a close reading of this poem were to support that. And certainly in 1918 in America, I'm in no way trying to deny that racism was a thing and was a real thing. Obviously, it still is. But my point is that might not be the reason or the main reason why, little Elizabeth finds the breasts horrifying. I mean, one thing is she probably has not seen breasts before. There was less of it, in the culture that people would see growing up in Massachusetts in 1918. I mean, hopefully kids today that are 6 years old are not, exposed to lots of things they shouldn't be exposed to. But, it was a very different time as far as nudity was something that was not, you didn't see a lot of in the culture at that time. I would also say, the kind of depiction of nudity that you would encounter in a National Geographic magazine at the time, it was not a titillating or sort of aestheticized depiction of nudity that you would see, like, whatever, in a Playboy magazine or something like that. It was the reason the people depicted were nude is because that's the way they lived their everyday lives in their culture. And so the other thing is that, and I don't know whether this factors into why they're described the breasts are described this way here, but that, women didn't wear brasiers, for instance. So the breasts themselves didn't appear the same way they would, in a different context. So I'm just trying to avoid a sort of knee-jerk response to a line like that, which I would totally understand why one would go in that direction, but it's important to sort of stay open to what that the poem might be leading somewhere else. So she says, I read it right straight through, meaning the magazine. I was too shy to stop. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly from inside, meaning in the other room, came an oh of pain. Aunt Consuelo's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. That's an odd thing for a 6-year-old to have perceived about their aunt, maybe. But Elizabeth Bishop was a precocious kid. She was described by people around her as, brilliant, even when she was very young and everything, and grew up to be one of the most important poets of the 20th century. I might have been embarrassed, but I wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice, in my mouth. Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. So, this is where I would totally understand that at this point in the poem, you might be confused. What does she mean? I was my foolish aunt, right? And it gets even weirder in a second here, where she says, I, and then she interrupts herself, we were falling. And I think that interruption, that sort of starts with I, interrupts, no, we, is the thing of going, the experience she's trying to describe is starting to defy language, which is also why we start with this language that's very mundane and just plainly descriptive. And it starts to get more poetic or more strange. Rhyme, images. We encountered our first simile in there. We're falling. There's more repetition. But what does she mean falling? She's sitting in a chair in a dentist office. She must mean metaphorically falling, because she is literally sitting in a dentist's office. Our eyes. So she's not the only one looking at the cover. Her aunt is looking at the cover with her, even though her aunt's in the other room. Something weird is going on here, and she's trying to explain it the best she can. And hopefully I'm running out of time, but hopefully we'll get a little more here so you can get going on this. Our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold, blue, black space. So this experience she had, hearing her aunt's voice and realizing that's my voice, and that then when she looks at the cover, we're looking at the cover. It's such an overwhelming experience that she feels like she's falling off the earth into blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I. You are an Elizabeth. You are one of them. So I, Elizabeth, and them there are all in italics. She's trying to use language to figure out what the hell is going on. And by what the hell is going on, I mean she's now starting to look at her everyday life, her just existence in life, which is becoming very strange to her. You are an Elizabeth. Not you are Elizabeth. You are an Elizabeth. You are one of them. So what does that mean? Well, let's read on and see if we find out. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. So part of her experience is she doesn't any longer know what she is. This is all somehow inspired by looking at these images in the magazine. And so I also think the horror she's talking about has to do with the horror of a mundane. So one thing I've talked about with students when I've tried to give a sense of what this poem might be about is, have you ever had the experience of where you say a word like soda, and you've said it a million times, but one day it sounds weird to you, and you go, soda. And then it can sound so weird, you go, am I even saying that right? Is that the word? And it's just a weird thing where suddenly something you take for granted appears to you almost like you've never seen it before, or how it would appear to someone from a foreign culture going, what's the word for this thing, but she's kind of having that experience about herself or about one of them, about people. So this is why she here says, she could barely even look at the people around her. And she ends that stanza by saying, I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. I'm running out of time, so I got to keep going. Why should I be my aunt or me or anyone? What similarities, Boots' hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts, held us all together and made us all just one. So I'm going to read that question she's asking without the interruption in the middle. She says, what similarities held us all together and made us all just one? So the interruption is a list of different things that maybe held us all together. But the question is, what similarities held us all together or made us all just one? Well, one thing I'd say is, when I said before that I'm not so sure that the horror she experiences by looking at the breasts of the black women is racism, is because here she describes the us, and I think here she means all people, as all just one. And that to me wouldn't really jibe with an idea that the horror she was talking about was racism. I think she's realizing something strange about the interconnectedness of people. And even that doesn't quite capture it. But, she's trying to figure out, how can I capture this in language? How, and then here again, she kind of fails. I didn't know any other word for it. How unlikely. How had I come to be here, like them, and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse, but hadn't? The waiting room was bright and too hot. Well, here I'll raise a question. What earlier in the poem was bright and hot that we saw? And how could that relate to this image here? It was sliding. What's the it there? The waiting room. The waiting room was sliding beneath a big black wave, another and another. What in the heck does she mean by that? Because could she mean that literally? If she means it metaphorically, what does she mean? And then the last stanza here, then I was back in it, raises the question, what does that mean, to be back in it? I guess the back sends us back to the beginning of the poem, and the language, notice, is kind of similar to the beginning, but I'm just leaving it up to you a little bit there. The war was on. Okay, what war? Well, we're going to find out in a second. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, were night and slush and cold, and it was still the 5th of February, 1918. So in 1918, the war would be World War I. So I guess I want to there draw your attention to the way in which the first image she encounters in the magazine is the volcano. And though it's initially described as black and full of ashes, it then spills over in rivulets of fire. So clearly that's an image both of light, fire, and heat. Towards the end of the poem, we encounter both, in the last two stanzas, images of heat and of cold and a war, in the context of her having had this experience of the oneness of people. And so it raises this question, what is she saying? Why mention the war for the first time there? What's the significance of it being warm in the room and cold outside? These are some questions to consider. Okay, I hope I didn't tell you too much. I hope I didn't tell you too little. I hope that helps to some degree. Do the best that you can. I'll be in touch.